list, but we need to make them more concrete and maybe more specific as well. I think one thing that is worth considering too as we start our conversation is what things are we likely to see addressed by other subcommittees that maybe we don't need to highlight, that we don't need to spend our capital on, because there's other things that as teachers we do need to spend our capital on. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So I think what we'll do is we'll actually go through our slide deck really quickly, and then we will get to talking. All right. All right, so our usual opening statement: the Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. All right, so we're going to actually do our discussion at the end, and we're going to take a look at some of the proposals and the slides, and then we will make sure that we're all clear on our next meeting details.
And just real quickly, there is a 423 number, another mystery number. If you don't mind to let us know who you are, I can make sure your attendance is recorded.
Representative Tim Hicks. I apologize. I can't get in on the link that I was given, so I'm sorry, but I can't get in through my email.
Yeah. I don't mind at all to resend it via email.
That would be perfect. I'm sitting right here in front of it. I don't know what's going on.
That's all right. I'll send.
All right, so our January is busy. We do have 3 meetings. This is meeting 4, where we're reviewing our initial feedback buckets and providing the prioritization of resources within each category. Some of the materials we've used or will be using are requested resources, requests for expert input, and public comment. Our next meeting, meeting 5, we will review public comment on the draft structure and then make final recommendations on formula components. The materials we'll be using are the public comments and expert access. Meeting 6, final policy considerations, for example, how to define each student group, recommendations on policies, recommendations on reporting structures, and the materials will be the requested resources.
Just wanted to also plug in just quickly that the department will be putting out a draft framework or draft formula based on all the feedback between meetings 4 and 5. So those will come out after this meeting. You know, we have a dead week in between. So there will be a draft based on all of the feedback. So that's another reason to really get tight today on your recommendations, really get solid. There will be a week of public comments on that framework before it comes back to you for final review. Do note that it will not include any dollar amounts. That is decided by the governor and the General Assembly. But it does provide us a space to really talk about what we really feel like needs to be included in the funding formula. So that is between meetings 4 and 5. Some words to highlight here. Meeting 4 is really the prioritization. There you go, Morgan, of those resources within each category. That's today. You can see my highlighting on the screen. Meeting 5, after the draft is out, it's going to be the review of that draft structure and then making your final recommendations on the formula. Also to really start thinking about the components, that the materials that folks might need to really initiate a new funding formula. And the meeting 6 is really going to be, this team is going to think about the policy considerations. What do we really have to consider in policy to make this happen? So today, prioritize. Meeting 5, review the draft and provide final recommendations. Meeting 6, take all that and think about policy.
Okay, so we're gonna save this for the end so that the majority of our time is spent on this. All right, so what we're going to do is review the consolidated ideas on the next couple of slides. We're going to provide some feedback on the overall, the base, the weights, the direct funding, the outcomes, and other. Let's do it, Jamie. All right, so some of the overall feedback that was received. So it was requested that districts should not receive less state funding than they currently receive in the BEP, that they maintain flexibility for local district budgeting, that they ensure whatever is currently funded outside of the BEP is included in a new formula, and that local match should be reconsidered. County commissioners and maintenance efforts should not change for school districts. So are there any other broad recommendations that you would include there, or any comments you have on these 4 requests? All right, let's move on. All right, the base. So the feedback on the base is the content currently being discussed in the subcommittees. So that's what we're already talking about. So these are the things that are critical to be included. So nurses at the recommended ratio, school-based supports, counselors and school psychologists at the recommended ratio, teachers' salaries and benefits, technology sustainability, flexibility for varied local needs like SRO, RTI2, principals and assistant principals, middle school CTE, and financial literacy. So looking at those priority areas, are there others that we would add here, and how would you prioritize them? And this is something we can actually do as we discuss our must-haves more, but if there's a good time, if you want to throw something out, I'll write it down and make sure we come back to it. All right, we'll come back to that. Okay, so for the weighted areas, the things that received the most positive feedback in terms of what should be weighted are the unique learning needs. So economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty, disability and gifted students, and include tiers on the cost to provide services, English language learners with some tiers based on English proficiency, as well as dyslexia. Rural, sparsity, and charter enrollment. So looking at these current priority areas, are there any other areas that you would add for weights, and how would you prioritize them, and how would you think about tiers for students with disabilities and English learners? This is a conversation I think we might be worth having in this moment now, because I don't necessarily think it's something we'll have time to revisit later today. So is there anything else here that you would like to see weighted that would, get a student extra funding dollars?
It's a quick point of clarification. Unique learning needs is a holistic bucket. So students would not receive additional funding per bullet underneath unique learning needs. It would be holistic. So if they fell within the unique learning needs bucket, they would receive that funding, but it wouldn't be extra. So you couldn't be ED and EL and get double the amount. You see what I'm saying? So it's holistic. So that might help just a little bit.
But you could be economically disadvantaged and rural and get 2 separate funding things.
Mm-hmm. So all of these things that are bulleted, sub-bulleted, I should say, under the unique learning needs, that consider that one kind of category. Can
we actually put that on a list for clarification? Because I had a different understanding of it, and I'm not in any way saying that my understanding is correct, but I had a different understanding because like if you're an English language learner and you have dyslexia, you're going to be served by 2 different teachers. So you're pulling from 2 different funding buckets.
Mm-hmm.
So if we could get some clarification or some more insight on that, that would be great.
Sure. Currently it's the commissioner definitely has, chatted with us a little bit, particularly in our meeting last week about this bucket. However, I do think it warrants some additional clarification. Okay, for sure.
I don't know if we could give the feedback that I think economically disadvantaged, like someone who's at a school that would be considered to get funding for that and rural, if we could move that as like its own consideration, that would be beneficial, I think, because I think whether or not students are rural or in the city, if you're economically disadvantaged, the likelihood of like there being other things connected to that increases. And if we have funding there, we're going to decrease academic concerns. So I don't know if that's even an option, but I kind of was surprised by that too, like being separate, I guess, or that like economic, I don't know. I think about trauma too. I don't know if there's a way to gauge that, but like I'm thinking about like Cookeville and the tornado that went through there a couple years ago, and talking to some teachers from out there is if there's been a traumatic event in the area, I think that that might be a good place to consider weighted funding as well, because that's going to impact kids academically.
Mm-hmm. Well, you remember the tricky part about the measuring the trauma is the weighted parts would be things that are happening every year. And so I don't know how, I mean, I don't necessarily know that that goes there, but I see what you're saying about that trauma and that the emotional needs. Like, how can we measure those as, like, that almost would fit more under the unique learning needs piece, right, than the economically disadvantaged. Okay.
Yeah, I almost think that those are separate. They were just both in my mind, and I didn't want to take up additional time. But yes, I would love to see that under unique learning needs as like trauma. I'm thinking about the flooding outside Nashville, things like that. If schools that have had trauma happen in their communities had the opportunity to get funding at that time, I think that would be really beneficial.
Okay, so we would add a weight under unique learning needs for trauma. Any suggestions about how we would tier students with disabilities and English language learners?
I think it would depend on the types of services that they are receiving, including, for example, the type of equipment that is needed to teach those students. Is how that should be based. A student with a language impairment or disability probably wouldn't require as much monies as a student who might require the adaptive technology for speaking.
Okay.
So on the unique learning needs, because I was kind of looking at those as different weights. So one student would only receive that one weight, no matter how many times they fall into that category. Okay, because those are quite different. And I think, like someone else was saying, that the needs of those students could be very diverse and even really specific, and maybe they might not need a lot of support, but you know, if a student were to fall into multiple categories under the unique learning needs, they could potentially need significant amounts of support. So that I did, when I read through the slides, I didn't interpret it that way.
Yeah. And I, you know, the more we talk about this, the more I see what Elizabeth was saying about keeping the economically disadvantaged under unique learning needs. If it is coming from a bucket and that you can't like double dip, so to speak, that it feels like you're trying to meet, like when I think about my students, I feel like we are trying to meet multiple needs. Like I can think of students who would fit 2 to 3 of those unique learning needs, and then to only receive the funding piece for one of them, I think would be doing them a disservice. So I
totally agree. I think the categorization doesn't make sense to me, because
Yeah.
you could have a very affluent school with many kids with dyslexia, and they're going to get the same funding as a school in a segregated, disinvested neighborhood in a city. That is not equal. I think that would be very frustrating to Tennesseans.
Yeah. So I think we would like to see that moved out of unique learning needs and into its own consideration.
I would think that all those indicators would be their own weight.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of think you almost need more buckets.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I don't know how many buckets can we have, but I think if you keep them all grouped and then they only qualify for they can only pull from that one bucket, even though they qualify. I mean, even though they meet 3 of those things, then we're going to be back in the same situation where we don't have the funding for the students that have needs now. I mean, then that's that's what we're doing here, you know? So, you know, I think if we keep them grouped like that, that's going to, you know, we're still not going to be reaching the students and getting them the needs that, you know, getting their needs met. If they all have to pull from that one bucket.
Can we take a brain break for a second and look at the charter enrollment bucket? And can somebody specifically say what that, like, what is that? Like, I don't know, just qualify exactly what kind of weighted situation it is with the charter.
Jamie, do you have more insight into that?
No, but I'll double check back in my notes as well. It's not coming to me right now. I do know that the student voice and choice subcommittee is really dealing with that heavily. So I know that's something they're juggling, but I'll look back through my notes for you, Cami.
Because we're talking about needing more buckets, and there's a bucket there. And I don't know what that means. Like, does that mean if they have lots of people enrolled in that thing, then they get more money? Like, is that kind of what that was just a question. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
That's the question is does that mean that it's based on their enrollment? Just because I don't see any extra things on there about that, just as a curiosity. So that's good.
Okay. Let me find out for you.
Yeah, it is a little surprising to see that as a weight, as a way that would pull extra educational dollars to go with a student. I can see what you're saying.
Really, what it looks like is it's merely based on numbers and enrollment, and we're up here trying to fit 5 buckets into one. So yeah, that would be great to get some clarification.
Okay. All right. So just to summarize quickly, and then we'll move on. Really, the unique learning needs we think actually should be separated, and students should be able to qualify for multiple areas. And we would move economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty out of unique learning needs to be its own specific consideration, along with rural and sparsity. We would also like clarification on the charter enrollment and how that would be used as a weight. In terms of tiering for students with disabilities, we would look more carefully at the needs these students have and how the degree to which they would need support services to meet their goals. Any specific suggestions for tiering students who are English language learners? Like, is this where like WIDA data? Hannah, do you have any insight?
Yeah, I think that you could pull in your WIDA access data if you wanted to have, if you wanted to look at, your screener data, if you have a 1 and a 2, or your WIDA access from the previous year, and you want to look at using 1 and 2 scores, and then maybe the scores of 3, 4s, 5s, or as students have exited, that they might not need to receive quite as much support, although you would need to look at the students who are receiving those direct services, because those are the students who would need to receive that hour. But I think that WIDA data would probably be the place to look at that, and not necessarily connecting to English learners, but kind of in this area, thinking about immigrant students, newcomers, and then migrant students as well, and kind of how that would fall in.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Okay, so we would specify that the WIDA data could be used to tier English learners, and we would maybe like some specific language about newcomers and migrants, as well as a weight or a unique learning need, because they may not necessarily fit the English language learner, but they would still have some needs that we would like to see addressed. Okay, Good, can we move on? Next slide. Okay, so additional dollars. So these are the areas that received the most positive feedback in terms of additional funding. So more dollars for a fast-growing school district, middle school CTE, innovative high school models. So like STEAM, I do not know all these acronyms because I am very much an elementary person, IHS, and PTEC. Anyone know what PTEC is? All right, and high dosage tutoring in 4th grade, which is coming from our learning loss bill. So looking at these priority areas, are there others you would add here, and how would you prioritize them? Anything else that you guys would like to see receive additional funding?
I know I've said this before as far as CTE goes, and I know it says middle school CTE, and it may be a conversation for a different part, but I think that CTE at the high school level too, you've got to throw some, maybe a little bit of funding or some increased pay for some of these professionals, because they're not going to leave their professional area to come and work in education and make a whole lot less money. You're just not going to get that many folks to do that. So I think, that could be where some additional dollars go, is in the CTE areas as a whole. Because
I think that's a great insight. So Jamie, can you add that we think this would be a good place to provide that additional pay to bring in experts into also high school CTE as well, so that we can get really qualified and knowledgeable people in there? That'd be great. Thank you, Erin.
Also, I would like to add, to piggyback off of Erin, is the equipment that it takes to run the CTE program, such as auto mechanics or welding, is quite expensive as well, and really needs to be updated on the cycle, so that each of the programs can be updated and current, and older equipment or maybe faulty equipment replaced. So I think not just for salaries, but also possibly for equipment.
Okay, let's do that. Let's specify that, please, too, Jamie. Thank you.
Yep. And just remember, CTE is current in the current funding formula. And so this is really thinking about what additional things outside of the current funding formula could you possibly do. And middle school was one that really bubbled to the surface. But I have down here increased salaries and additional equipment needs.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Okay. Oh, thank you, Daniel. Okay, so Daniel just clarified the PTEC in the chat, that it's where high school students can currently earn an industry certification and an associate's degree while in high school. Okay. All right, any other feedback for our additional dollars?
I think some department funding with CTE and things like that being considered. I also think for the arts, and I know that there's been some funding put there as well, but even in like elementary school, if we could increase investment in like the educational experience as a whole earlier on by targeting things that students are very interested in, which is similar to what they do with CTE and STEAM programs and things like that. Also with the arts, I would love to see money go to that in elementary, middle, and high school. I don't think there's a place that we couldn't use money for that, but especially in communities where that funding isn't at right now, and so students aren't having those opportunities, which those things lead to academic success. There's so much research on that. So
okay, so your point I definitely heard, and that makes me wonder if we actually want to have that conversation by placing that more in the must-have or should-have categories, rather than something that would be like additional dollars, because I don't that sounds to me like that's more of a need, something we don't want to go without the school level.
This is additional. This is literally what it says, additional dollars, right? This isn't our big things. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Moving on.
Yep. Currently, right now, all you're thinking about is the base, the weights, and the direct funding, so that you can kind of get any additional out of that. And then from that, narrow it down into your must shoulds. You got it.
All right, let's go on to the next piece. Okay, outcomes. So these are things that would be receiving, like based on, this is like, well, it depends on what are the measures, whether it's like number of students completing or achieving a certain level within some of these areas. So early post-secondary opportunity, AP course completion or passing, industry certificates or certification, work-based learning completion metric, reading proficiency. And this is something specifically that the commissioner said they are looking for some information on how you would measure that an outcome in literacy, especially in K-2. The universal screener is not an option for that, as well as differentiated compensation support. So looking at these priority areas, is there anything that you would add that could be considered an additional outcome? So a way for a student, you know, or a district, sorry, if a student enrolls in that specific program, they would receive additional dollars for that participation or completion or achievement. One other big question to consider here is, do you recommend including all students or only students with historic achievement gaps? So low income, students with disabilities, and or English language learners. And I don't want to ignore that question. I think that's really important, that piece about how these outcomes are addressed in terms of who is still generating those dollars and who may not. What do you have? What thoughts?
I would say you consider all the students that are involved in these programs. I mean, I don't know if maybe I'm just not understanding the question, but I think that you know, your success on or your outcomes, you know, I mean, you want positive outcomes in all of these areas and not just positive outcomes for low income kids, you know, not just positive outcomes for English language learners. You want positive outcomes and good percentages of completion rates and all of those things that are on that screen. You want that for everybody. So I don't, maybe I'm just not understanding, but that's what I would say is I think that the outcome needs to be focused on everybody,
Okay.
all of the students.
All right, so we would recommend including all students in the outcomes. Any disagreement or any strong feelings?
I have a slightly different perspective. I think that when I see like AP course completion, teaching an AP course in a school that's been a high poverty school for years, I can be the highest rated effective teacher and be very successful and able to even train other AP teachers and not see the same passing rates because the students are coming in at very different literacy levels. That can also be the same with EPSO options with dual enrollment. Like kids can't enroll at the University of Memphis. We have dual enrollment options, but they have to have a 21 on the ACT to do so. So theoretically, I like all, but I've recognized the way that a friend that teaches in suburban Memphis at Houston High School in Germantown, their kids are passing the AP exam like it's a piece of cake because they're coming in with so much background knowledge and their K-12 experience has been different. Their home experience has been different. So I don't necessarily want to see funding tied to people who are already successful, continuing to be successful. But I don't think it should be tied just to urban students at all. I think urban and rural, historically marginalized or disadvantaged groups would be excellent to tie funding there because the goal is to increase funding as we're seeing gains made in our most vulnerable spaces. So that's my different perspective.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Both making excellent points.
I would say that I tend to agree with Daniel a little bit with like the reading proficiency and the multiple ideas on measurement, thinking about that as a fourth grade teacher, and fourth grade typically is a year in testing that we see like where the gaps are. My students, my growth is always good and my achievement may not be. So making sure that we're not, we want to incentivize achievement. Obviously, we want all students to achieve. My recommendation for that then, if we're trying to look specifically at that question, is that maybe we could incentivize it all, but put a more heavy weight on incentivization of the communities that have historic marginalization. I don't know if there's a way to do that, but like everybody can get credit for having like AP course completion, but more money goes to schools where like if Daniel versus his friend have the same outcome, that might have required more staff to get the students to the same space.
Okay. So I guess, Jamie, that's actually more of a question for us, is if we can weight the outcome programs. So rather than making it an all or some question, we would like to know if it would be possible to weight these outcome measures to help close that achievement gap.
So currently what I have is consider open to all students, but with a heavier weight on marginalized communities. And I'll put that in the question bank too.
Okay, perfect.
I like
Thank
that.
you.
That's what I have.
Cool.
All
Does
right.
that sound-
Thing. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay, any other thoughts on outcomes? Because otherwise we're pushing on. Okay, so we will go back to, all right. So when I was looking back at our meeting takeaways and recommendations from December, our meeting notes under our must-haves, right now all we have is universal pre-K and SROs with a high level of training. We want one per school. Now, it's not saying that we haven't had these conversations. We have a lot of things that Jamie's recorded in our base, and I think what we need to do today is make those more concrete, like with some actual recommended, like we have teacher-student ratio written down in our base. And I think that, I know sometimes it's hard to talk about the specific numbers because we don't necessarily have those recommended ratios at our fingertips. But I feel comfortable knowing the groups we represent in teaching that we could recommend some teacher-student ratios at most grade levels at this point. So why don't we start there under our must-haves? So for teacher-student ratio, let's start with, I guess, K-2. Any suggestions for the ratio that we would like to see maintained or changed?
You just want us to throw out actual numbers?
Yeah, let's make this as specific as we can. Like, this is our chance to say that, you know, more than 20 kindergartners in a room, well, more than 15 kindergartners in a room is a challenge or difficult, you know. So this is our chance to shoot for the moon for these low class sizes that we all know benefit our students.
Yeah, I taught first grade for 15 years, and 25 is a lot of first graders. I had up to 28 because if you get over 25 in the first 10 days, past the first 10 days, it doesn't matter. So I've had 28. This isn't the place to change that, but that needs to be changed. It needs to be, you hit 25, something happens. Had 25 in second grade, and it's a lot, but I can't imagine having 25 in kindergarten, especially because I know our district doesn't, well, our school, some classrooms do have assistants in kindergarten. You know, some kindergarten classes don't have assistants. So I know right now it's a K2 average, but maybe that's changed. I mean, if we lower it for K2, that's fine, but we definitely have to lower it for kindergarten, I think.
Okay. So would we be comfortable with a ratio of 1 teacher to 20 students within K2, or should we go even lower to kind of prevent that? Because we all know what happens is then you have first grade classes that are sitting at 14, and then that doesn't help out your second grade classes that are sitting at 23 or 24. So if we lower the ratio, then we would have, you know, less likelihood of running into that problem where a low year affects a heavy year.
Okay, I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say 20 is a much better number for K2, just having been 18 years in K2.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
On the slide right now, we are discussing student teacher ratio, and that's not on here because we're about to add it, or?
No, so what I'm talking about now are all the things that we currently have listed in our base, but what we need to fill in is our must have and our should have list. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes that Jamie sent me from last meeting, and we've done a really good job of discussing, but we need to categorize and get down some firm numbers and thoughts.
Okay, because in lieu of ratios, I'm looking at where it says teacher salaries and benefits, and I was wondering if on this includes, if anywhere on this it is going to include more teachers, like funding for more teachers, because the ratio cannot be changed without that. So because both of those are missing, I was like, should I say? But could we say 1 in 15 students, or like, is that even a possibility? So that clears that up. Yeah.
Well, and I think too, if that ratio is something that is a must-have, then once you're exceeding that ratio, a teacher would have to be provided to meet that ratio. We want this to be like a must-have. Like, you cannot have more than on average 15 students in a K-2 classroom, and then once you go above that average, a new teacher is summoned, hired. There we go.
Right. So elementary teachers, is that 20 okay, or would 15 be nicer?
Well, as someone who works with a ratio of 20, what happens is sometimes you have like a low group, like kindergarten classes are small, but then what happens is our ratio, I think, is K-3 that we work with, and it has to be 20. And so what happens is third grade might end up with large class sizes because the K classes are small. So because the average is taken from K-3, I think the lower the ratio we look for, the more likely we are to see smaller class sizes.
Yeah. I say ask for the 15 so you can get the 20.
Okay, let's do it.
So it's the K3 average. Oops, I'm not muted. It's the K3 average, but then it's the absolute cap of 25.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you're saying, Morgan, like if we don't lower that absolute cap, then you could still have like 25 in a class.
Okay, so let's do both.
Average could be super, even though your average, like you're saying, you do end up with some classes maybe having 14 because of that average.
Okay, so I hear what you're saying. So let's do both. So let's change the teacher-student ratio for maybe we should do 3 because it's K-3 in the, right? Is it K-3?
I think if we're going to require testing in third grade as kind of like a gate, the way that the legislation is this year, I think making it K-3 with 15 would be a great idea. I think early literacy will positively impact every single one of us. So
I would even say,
if I could possibly interrupt. Not where I work, but where I live. Let me just clarify. Having worked at the central office, in rural counties where you might have 7, for example, where I came from, they had like 6 schools, and it's very rural, and they were pre-K 8 schools. So the way you decided how many teachers you could have, for example, for the K-3, you took the number of students that were enrolled in that district, and you divided it by, for example, if the cap was 20 by 20, which would allow you to have so many kindergarten teachers. So what we're suggesting, though, what if, for example, in those 7 schools or 6 schools, you might have 24 or whatever that live in that area, but then over here in the valley, for example, you might only have 10. So what ended up happening is it wasn't based upon school, it was based on the number of students in the district. So am I misinformed, or how is that calculated? That's the question I want, especially for very rural schools in that situation, because if it's calculated the way that I perceived it was, that needs to be addressed as well if it's not per school.
That's an excellent question. I have absolutely no insight into. Does anyone have any insight to that one?
That's happened to me where I've had 28 kids and someone else in my district has had 18 and 3 teachers, and we had 2 teachers with 28. I think that if we say that our average is 15 and we cap it at 20, though, like if we're very specific about that language, that could protect it, because there's a very big difference between having, like, if Sharon had 15 kids and I had 20, I'm not feeling like that's a disparity as much as if she had 18 and I have 28. So I think if we said something very specifically about 15 is the average, but 20 is the cap for all teachers, that could help protect that from happening in our rural communities.
Okay. And could we be specific too that this teacher-student ratio, we would like it a school-based as instead of district-based? Would that help solve that problem?
So currently it's in state law. There's a difference between class size average and class size maximum, and which can be waived and which cannot. So, yeah, so I think it is important to pull those apart.
Okay. So we want to specify that the teacher-student ratio, we would like to be done at the school level, not necessarily district level. We would like an average in K to 3. I think we could even argue K to 4 because most of our elementary schools are K to 4. And I know it always is like, you know, in 3rd grade, they go having their average of 20, and then all of a sudden in 4th grade, you get up like 25 to 28 of them. And we would like to lower the class cap to 20 down from 25. Does that make, am I summarizing that correctly? Okay. All right. So moving on to our next grade bin, we'd be looking at 5 to 8. Does that make sense? Middle school people, help me out.
I believe that's correct.
Okay. So what kind of teacher-student ratios make sense? Let's be concrete and let's do the same. Let's stick with the teacher ratio and as well specify caps if you guys have any. And if not, let's put one in place.
I think, and this is middle school, other middle school teachers say, because I don't have a cap. I have thousands of children. But I think in a regular classroom, it's 24, 25, like a academic math, English content. And then in related arts classes, it's 35, which we see. I have an art class right now that's packed to 43, all trying to do things. So it's different. That's another thing that might ought to be addressed with the elementary, is that there are different, there may be different rules for your related arts teachers. That's what we're called. We're not related, but that's what we're called. And 35, I think, is my cap. So I think it's 25. If there's another middle school person on the call, I think it's 25. Is there not another middle school? Okay. Yeah.
I know that in 4th and 5th grade, which is not middle school, the absolute max is 30. So I don't know. So it would seem like 6th grade would be the cap, would be that the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do we suggest? Let's hammer down some specific numbers for teacher-student ratio in middle school.
I would say an average of 20, at least an average of maybe 20 and a maximum of 25.
All right, let's do it. Cammie, do you think it would be smart to specify that these caps should remain the same for related arts? Since you're teaching the masses.
We're putting in our must-haves more arts and things, and that includes getting more teachers and more options for kids for that type of stuff. And so it would, if they did that, that's where they could get the money to make that ratio the same. Yeah. I'll do, just, I'm throwing something out there since we're dreaming. We changed it from 20. What is the likelihood of it staying the same throughout their middle school years as it was in the elementary? I mean, the reason I say that is because, again, I don't know if there's another middle school person on here, but that's a really trying time. It's a crazy trying, the middle school years. And so if this is about what we think would be great for kids, that I don't know about changing it. If further down the road, it would be okay to keep it like it was in elementary, where we had 20 middle schoolers. What a middle school English teacher could do with just 20 kids. I've never seen that in my life. So, so I mean, I get the change, and the reasoning, I guess, is the reasoning because they can go to the bathroom by themselves, and most of them know how to read. But do you know what I mean? That might be something to dream about.
Okay. We do have to make, just in the interest of time, I'm so sorry. We got to hammer something down here for middle school so that we can move on to the high school levels as well.
So what was the elementary recommendation? It was 20.
20 is a cap and a ratio of 1 to 15, and we wanted it calculated at the school level, not the district level.
Okay, so you could go up by 5. 20 with a cap of 25. Okay. Although, yeah. Because I think now it's 25 with a cap of 30, so that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, those 5 bodies make a big difference.
And then I would stick the specification, especially when you get into higher level things happening in the arts. or in the, when I say related arts, I mean the PE and the, all the things.
Okay.
Health.
Okay. All right. High school ratios. Any specific suggestions for what we would do there?
Well, I personally, as a high school teacher, would like to see it capped at 30 and have 25, the ratio of one teacher to 25 students. I currently have, I think, 32, 33. And that's a lot, especially
That is
when
a lot.
you cannot social distance
Yeah.
with that many students.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any further thoughts? Or are we comfortable with that ratio?
Well, and I'll just throw out there, CTE has a little bit of a different ratio anyway, as part of their program. So, and I don't know that necessarily would need to change, but I think that these lower ratios with these students will help a lot of the other things that we're talking about. If we have more time to spend with fewer students, then we can help them more with the things that they need. You know what I mean? Like we're talking about, we need all of these other people to help them because we don't have the time to help them. But if we increase our teachers and lessen the students that we have, then we would have more time. I'm not saying that those other folks aren't needed, but I'm just saying that we would then be able to, because some of the kids feel like they get lost because there's 35 kids in the room, whereas if there's only 25 in the room, then we can spend more time with each one of them and, do that one-on-one stuff, even though it still may not be all that they need. It might be more than we can give them now.
Okay. So what would be like concrete suggestion? Like what numbers would be the best fit to meet those needs? Because you're right.
I think 25 would probably be 25 is what CTE is capped at. So we don't go over 20, we don't go over 25. There might be occasions where we in our school have gotten maybe 26 or 27, but I know the other teachers in the building have more than 25. And I know that that's difficult. So I would say 25 is a good cap. I know I'm not the only high school teacher on here, but I'm also a CTE teacher, so I'm in a little bit of a different spot,
Yeah. No, we appreciate it. That's good. Okay. Next in our base we have as counselors, and the note next to it we would like to do better than the national recommended ratio. So that is 250 students per counselor, if I remember correctly. Do we have a specific ratio that we would like to work with other than just the suggestion better than the national recommended ratio?
I remember when we talked about this before, we had talked about having at least one at each school, even if the school didn't have somebody was talking about rural schools. Do you remember that conversation?
Yes.
And
so that's why, so if we get a specific ratio, we can also add the note that the recommendation that there still be one at each school for schools that are not meeting the ratio, that we do not recommend splitting counselors between schools and things like that.
I think 1 to 200 would be a great ratio, because if we're talking about capping classes at 25, then that's 4 classes. And when I think about meaningful relationships, effective mental health interventions, and like really getting students to have positive academic results from the interventions put in place by school counselors, I think 1 to 200, I think if we go any higher than that, we're not dreaming as big as we could. And then saying in addition to that, 1 at every single school. So even if the school has 180 kids, they get a counselor there too, because then like in an elementary school setting, 1 to 200 is like 4 grades, I guess. So that feels more realistic than them trying to do, I don't know, like pre-K 5.
Jamie, did you just write that the State Board of Education requires 1 to 350?
That's current.
Wow.
That the Tennessee State Board of Education.
Yeah, you can highlight that. I don't know why it makes the font black, but you can kind of highlight over top of it and you can see it.
Okay. Yeah, so that's what we're currently working with in Tennessee, and then the national recommendation is 250. That's good to know. Okay, so do you still feel like one counselor for every 200 students is what we want, or do we stick with the national recommendation?
I like 1 to 200, like Elizabeth said.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, so another thing, sorry, go ahead.
Clarification, 1 to 200 for
Students. Oh, yeah, sorry. One counselor per 200 students. And we agree all levels, elementary, middle school, and high school, or do we want to see any adjustments?
Well, you are going to do an annotation where it says, but if you only have 115 kids enrolled in this rural school, you got to have somebody on staff. Okay.
Yes. All good, Jamie?
Cami, say that again, Cami.
That for small rural schools that might just have 115, you still have to have a counselor in the building. Like, I graduated a class of 69 kids. So, yeah, a small school, especially rural areas.
Okay, so
counselor, not a shared counselor.
Yes, exactly. Full counselor. Okay, one other piece in our base that I think that we should address as a committee, because we are teachers, is the teacher salaries and benefits. So some of the notes we have are more competitive with outside markets and neighboring systems, which I think we kind of clarified that with the additional dollars. So that could be a way we serve that. Support for families or parents, flexibility and support with medical, social, emotional needs, and additional planning time. So I'm trying to think, how do we put that in our must-have? So put it in our must-have, please, Jamie. And then let's get more specific about let's rank that kind of priority list, and let's try to be a little bit more concrete, like the additional planning time. That's a nice concrete suggestion about how they can support teachers and maintain teachers as well, so that we aren't seeing people leave the profession or leaving rural areas. Or is it possibly a way of attracting teachers to a rural area to make up for some pay discrepancies? Is there any other more concrete suggestions? So we have some discussion here about flexibility and support for medical, social, emotional needs. What could that possibly look for that we could ask for this in our must-haves?
I'd love to ask for a school social worker specifically. And I mean, if we're dreaming big, I think that there should be a school. So I don't know what the state recommendation is currently for school social workers. But if we're wanting a specific staffing option, I would say like at least one school social worker for even like an elementary, middle school, high, like a feeder school situation. So if they're working with sibling groups, but that would be an option and then that way we have people that are invested in the education of these students throughout the entire process of getting them through the public education system.
Okay.
I just read something the other day about where they're starting to put social workers in local libraries. So that's a tremendous need. And I know our social workers we have one in our building and she is full up. Like, and that's kind of like the same with the guidance counselor. You can give them so much and then no one's getting served well,
I think I think at the very, whenever you first mentioned this, whenever we're talking about teacher salary and benefits, I think that people don't come into education because they aren't going to get paid to do it, and it was just in the news last week or 2 weeks ago that, and I don't remember who it was, correction officers or something, or their base salary is now $10,000 more than the beginning salary for a teacher. You're not going to bring people into education that way. So I don't know what the concrete number is. I don't know what that is, but having more teachers and paying them what they deserve to be paid has got to be like priority number one. It's got to be, and you're going to have to pay the social workers and you're going to have to pay the counselors. Like, it can't be this minimal we'll pay them a little bit if they'll just come in the building. Like, you're not going to get good people to do that. So, and I don't know how that's worded. I don't know how you say that, but at the very base, that's what's got to happen.
Yeah.
Could we put something like a 20% increase in teacher salary? I mean, I know if we're dreaming big, that would be what somebody said, a livable wage. I would love to put that number in there. Like, that would make us, I mean, still not even competing with other people with the levels of education that teachers have, but that's a big incentive number.
That would be a big incentive. That would definitely attract people that are currently working in other areas.
And I would say raise starting pay to $50,000.
Okay. All right. We comfortable with both those concrete suggestions under teachers' pay, as well as additional planning time?
Okay, so I have the raise starting pay to 50K. What was the other one, if there were two?
Elizabeth said 20% pay increase.
Yeah, if corrections officers are making $44K, we got to start a little higher, man.
Okay.
Well, and I think we just need to be paid as professionals. I mean, there are other professions that get paid a lot of money, and they go to school to be trained to do very important things. And I think that, coming from the medical field, because I mean, I no longer am a nurse like at the hospital, but I know I could go over there tomorrow and make twice what I'm making, and so you're not going to pull good people in to do these things, because teachers are just as much of a professional, entity as a nurse or, whatever. They're just as much professionals. And I think that we need to be paid that way.
Okay. So in the interest of time, there are a couple of things that are in our base that we haven't covered that I want to ask you whether they need to remain as must-haves or if they should be placed as should-haves. Keeping in mind that these are teaching perspective, because this is our chance to ask for the things that we know we need to do our job well. So some things that we didn't cover today are school nurses. We've talked about a ratio of 1 for every school. And SROs with a high level of training, which right now we do have that in our must-have. Would you keep that in our must-have?
I would definitely keep the nurse.
Okay.
Was there a specification about the SROs and the high training? Or because that's pretty.
We don't have anything specific in terms of training. The words that we have recorded are high level of training.
I liked in a previous slide talking about local flexibility in regard to use of dollars for things like SROs versus other things, because hearing the arguments from the rural teachers, I think it makes great sense to have a person who's an SRO for a district or a high school in a rural area. And it's very different than already overly policed communities in some of our cities.
Okay, so let's keep that in our must-have, because the base things are our must-haves. And so can we keep that flexibility for varied local needs, and in that list, make sure we still have SROs? As well as the things that are already listed there. So it's not that we want to get rid of those, Jamie. We just want to make sure that that's included in our list. Does that make sense, everyone?
I wanted to ask about the preschool, because I know we talked a lot about that. So I wanted to just see if it had kind of where that was, or maybe if it was going to fall somewhere else, or if it was not making that list.
So that was one of the first things that went into our must-have. So I've left it there. Does anyone got any further thoughts on that? And one thing that Commissioner Swin did bring up in the preschool was at what age group do we start that? Do we start that at 4 or 3? Any thoughts?
3.
Okay.
2.
At birth. Bring them in.
Well, we want it to be a preschool, not a daycare.
It's true. It's true. So I have worked in an education system where we do start kindergarten at at 3 and 4, it was called junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten. And depending on the, when your birthday was when you started. But I've worked in a system that did that, and it was that's it. You know it, Daniel. So I've been there. I've seen it. It does work. A lot of people think like they're too little. They're not. These kindergarten teachers are amazing. And it is treated like kindergarten. It's not very different. Like you have full teachers. You did get funding for assistance as well, to help make that happen, because that's difficult having that many 3 and 4-year-olds in a room. But these kids were learning. They had
a ratio. Then do we need to say a ratio for the preschool classes if we had to clarify that for somebody else?
Yes, I think so.
And I would also
as well,
add
go ahead.
The transportation piece. I think that would be crucial in some areas. I mean, just having that as an option, I think, considering that piece for funding.
Okay, so we would keep universal pre-K. So we would like to see it changed, not something that's necessarily you're enrolled in because you meet an achievement gap area, but because you are just simply 3 or 4 years old. In our district right now, our pre-K classes are taught by certified teachers. Should we specify? Okay. And a suggested ratio for our pre-K classes?
Not 25, because I taught preschool and pre-K one time with 25 kids, and that's why I teach middle school. So
yeah. What if we keep our ratio?
Isn't there a law that when you're talking about, I mean, because even though it is a preschool, you are talking about children that are under 5 years old. So is there a law out there that states how many certified or trained people you can have with X amount of children?
Yes, I think you're right.
I think it's a law about how many adults there can be, but I don't think it's necessarily that they have to be certified. From working for the YMCA in the past, I know that like age depended from the state how many kids you were allowed to have, but it didn't mean the like level of training necessarily you had to have. So I think a certified teacher per 15 kids.
That's how it was when I taught at a school, and we had a pre-K and preschool. There was a main teacher who was certified in early education, and then there was someone else that was there all the time, but it was just another set of eyes and that kind of thing. Okay. A teacher's assistant, essentially.
Okay. All right. In the interest of everybody's time and out of respect for the evening that you are giving up, yeah, Jamie.
All right, so I need to read over the recommendations. Okay. Get your all's thumbs up. So actually, instead of reading them, I'm going to share my screen.
Perfect.
And the way it's bucketed is base. Give you just a second to read over those, and I'll scroll down. We didn't have a start at the age 3 or 4.
Okay. Any thoughts? Do you want to clarify that right now?
I'm going to quote Mr. Hill earlier in our meetings when we first started this. The earlier we can catch them and the earlier we can introduce them to services with a social worker and with things going in the home, the better foot they'll be on when they get on up in their years in public school. Mm-hmm. And we don't have universal health care or that kind of thing. Universal child care. We don't have those things. And so those aren't afforded to a lot of people to be able to have child care. And they are amazing. The people that do this work are amazing people. So I would vote 3.
Okay.
I would say 3. And I think in this too, you might want to think about changing the counselors down to 1 counselor every 50 or 100 kids and lower that in this age group, because
I can foresee that there's going to be a big need for that. And I think we need to ask for everything we can. And I think that's really where we got to start catching them, is right here.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to specify start at age 3 and consider dropping our counselor recommendation to an even lower ratio to 100.
When we're thinking about the universal pre-K, we're looking at that as an option for families, right? So it's not, I feel like that's a little bit difficult if it's an optional thing, how to look at how it will be funded. I mean, I'm sure, enrollment, but still, I think that can be a little bit challenging. So when you're looking at 3 and 4, maybe it's a rollout, maybe you're looking at, I don't know, I'm just throwing out things, maybe you start with 4 and then you build into a larger program. Because I think that's a whole mind shift for a lot of families. They're still thinking about kids being little and, starting education earlier, I think it's a transition. So
I see what you're saying, but I argue that there are, well, not argue, but I counter with the fact that there are a lot of families who struggle to find pre-K that they can afford that fits a work schedule. Having a pre-K that follows a school schedule that is, and like these kids, they went to related arts too. Like, sorry, Cammie, I don't know how you feel about teaching music to 3-year-olds, but
that was me. That was
did
me
it
in the room with that many preschool and pre-K. I've seen that.
Yeah.
That setup.
Yeah. So to me, this is a solution for a large number of families. It alleviates daycare fees. It alleviates. It's a huge help for the families of Tennessee, as well as we see the assets of being able to address learning gaps earlier on. It means we have more eyes on kids early on, so that we know the supports we can provide these families earlier on. So I see what you're saying, but I don't think we need to necessarily worry now about how we would roll that out. Let's just say we see this as a need in Tennessee. We see this as a way to address the gaps that we know are coming, right?
And Hannah,
no, I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that.
And also remember, meeting 6 is really when we're thinking about policy considerations. So what does that actually look like in policy? So it's coming.
Yeah. So remember that for meeting 6, Hannah.
So just for a moment, let me go back. Representative Hicks, help me out here. So I have 1 to 100 for K-12, but I believe you were saying for those lower grades, it needs to be a lower ratio. Or did you mean?
I'm saying that K through 12 would be 200.
Okay.
Pre-K would maybe roll down to 100. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you.
And if that, should that also include social worker ratio?
I don't know. I have it on there.
Okay.
Keep it, leave it.
I
Thumbs
like
up,
that.
down.
Mm-hmm.
I would add a lower social worker ratio too. I mean, if we're talking about earlier intervention, let's help these families out when these babies are little and decrease the amount of trauma they experience. And as a whole family, I think we'll see major changes for families across Tennessee if we are able to do stuff like that.
Okay.
Yep.
So here are, go ahead.
So would there be more than 100 or 200 or 50 pre-K students in a school? Like maybe I'm just, I don't know because I don't teach pre-K, but like the elementary school that I used to school nurse at, there was one class and there was 15 or 20 kids or something like that. So are we adding an additional, are we saying we're adding additional people just for that class? Or if we keep the one, we need to have one of these people per building, would that be okay? Or were we wanting to add more? Maybe I'm just confused. I don't know.
Well, that may actually even shake out when we're talking about policy in meeting 6. If that person is a full-time in-house counselor, so to speak, or if there is a counselor that travels between 2 or 3 schools, services those 3, and is considered that 1 to 100. I mean, you can kind of shake out some of the specifics later, I think, too.
I think we were thinking about adding more than like the one, and then preschool gets another one, because I think we were looking at additional resources and maybe someone who has a specialization in early childhood education, because that makes a big difference. So I think if we were dreaming big, I would add like maybe not per school, like still have that one per school, but like one in my district, say we have 300 preschoolers enrolled, we have 3 counselors that might spread out and help with preschool across the district.
Yeah.
Okay, so could we specify then that this could be shared between schools?
I think so.
Okay.
I think that would be okay, because they're gonna be the way they are now. They're, you know, sort of spread out and smaller, and we've got those smaller ratios. I think that would be okay to do.
Okay.
It might take with those ratios. It might take 2 or 3 schools sharing one just to get 100.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Just looking at the rest of Jamie's notes, anything else we would like to specify or change about the weights, the direct funding, or the outcomes?
For the language on weight, I think pulling economically disadvantaged out of the unique learning needs bucket so that it is independently considered.
Yes.
Is helpful language.
Yes. Okay.
I also was
Right.
thinking about, Elizabeth said 20% pay increase and I said 50K starting. I was thinking about, some districts, Shelby County School starts at like 44, 45, I think. So 20% would be better than 50, but I was thinking about some rural spaces that might be in the, upper 30s. Like if you're at 38, 20% is only going to, it's only going to get you to like 45,000. So I was trying to think of a way to say like 20% increase, but if that doesn't get you to $50,000 starting pay, you need to get there,
Yep.
With a minimum?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That would be great.
20% pay increase to base salary with a minimum of 50K. That work?
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Sure.
Back to what you just said, Morgan, about the weight. This isn't where the charter thing is. That's from another committee's notes, correct? Our charter question, the bucket of charter.
Yes, let me double check, see if I've heard anything yet. Public charter, we spend a lot outside of BEP for charter facility funds and feedback comments or to bring these into a single formula. So addressing needs for public charter schools. So it's public charters, not private.
Okay.
Cami, does that help at all?
Well, I just see that rate box right there, and we don't have anything in there. Do we have an opinion about that we need to add?
Right, like charters being a part of the BEP is great, it's fine, but having as its own category, I think Cammy's saying doesn't make sense, and I agree.
Okay, so where do we move that funding to?
Teacher salary. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
I think that part of the need for charter schools has come from a lack of resources in marginalized communities. So we put that money into marginalized communities. I mean, I don't know how, maybe I'm incorrect about that, but not always. But I think we put that money into public, like directly to the students. I don't know.
Or into the other buckets. Like, do we just take that off of the menu potentially? Because it was weighted because it was, I forget. It was weighted because it was an additional, something that needed to receive additional.
Yeah, so a student enrolled in that public charter enrollment, that would generate additional dollars for that school.
Yeah, and it was on there with things like trauma and schools that were in poverty, and that doesn't make any sense to me. So that's why I said just take it out and spread the rest of it out.
Right,
Okay.
and I'm not against charter schools receiving funding based on their students, just like all public schools in Tennessee. I'm just against it being, and what I'm hearing Cammie say is against it being its unique thing that generates additional dollars because it's a charter, but it should be included in the general formula, but not for extra money simply
That's right.
because of the charter. Yeah.
I agree.
So how would you like it to be represented here?
Charter schools should receive the same funding that other public schools do and not receive additional dollars.
But yeah, just charter
staff.
schools charter schools do not receive additional dollars per enrollment because that's what we're all doing.
Beyond state funding, regular, typical state funding or something.
I think essentially what we're saying is it doesn't need to be weighted more. Like we're weighting certain things, but charter enrollment shouldn't be weighted more in order to generate more funding.
Okay. So their funding should come from the same base funding as what we are pulling from.
Okay, just read over it.
I think I would still like to see the unique learning needs separated. I think they all can be their own weights, really.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Same.
For the very clear reason that I think you argued earlier, Hannah, which is that a student that's dyslexic, economically disadvantaged, and needs to see a school psychologist is going to need varying professionals who have funded positions. So totally
I mean, some of the weights that's in that unique learning needs, I think is the most important thing we're doing in this whole BEP funding shift. So I think if we don't get that little segment right, then we're missing it.
Agreed.
Well said, Vice Chair Hopper.
Hear, hear.
All right. Anything on direct funding or outcomes? I know one of the big pushes was to really consider whether it's all students or those that are just included in an achievement gap conversation.
Yep. Do we feel comfortable with that sentence? How it summarizes our thoughts?
I kind of think it could just mirror the weights in a way.
Mm-hmm. So does a heavier weight?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it takes funding to do, to run these programs. I mean, there's some initial funding that has to happen, but I mean, when we're looking at, we're thinking about unique learning needs and all those things, I feel like those weights could go into that. I'm not sure if that would work, but I just feel like, if you're looking at weighting things, maybe this is a way that you could kind of tie those two together.
Yeah.
And that makes sure that standardized testing doesn't become punitive for educators, but a way to get more funding if there's gaps. Not if teachers need more training, we get more training. If teachers need more resources, we get more resources. If we need more interventionists, we get more interventionists. So I think that that's a good way to put it, so that funding needs are addressed as they come up.
Well, and I think several of those things that were in that outcome section are specifically related to high school. I mean, just seeing all of that, I see that every day. I look at EPSOs, I look at industry certs and all that. And so I think that if we look at the weights and we apply the funding in that weighted area appropriately, like Hannah said, if we get that part right, then by the time they're to the point that we are certifying them for an industry cert, they're in that opportunity. You know what I mean? Whereas now they may be missing the opportunity because we're so focused on just making sure that they graduate, that we're trying to make sure that they're getting all of the math and the reading intervention that they maybe haven't received up to the point, where they could take the industry cert test or get that early post-secondary, so I think that if we get that weighted part right, and like Hannah just said, if it can mirror the weights, that would probably be a good thing. But I think if we get that part right, then those other opportunities that come along later on in 11th and 12th grade, which is when all of those things happen, then it might make it easier just because the process has been better. Does that make sense? I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, I think so. And I've added in the sentence just marginalized students / communities. Thinking that may cover that conversation. Do you think that is clear enough?
Could I have a little bit of clarity on marginalized? In the sense, again, I live in a community that is very poverty stricken and very rural. That's not inner city. Would that be considered marginalized as well?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Because so like Hannah's point about using the weights to help us weight our outcomes, basically. So anything that would qualify as a weight, like, would be considered marginalized to me anyways. And we can be more specific about this language, but that anything that qualifies as a weight, we think would give you an additional outcome dollar on top of the ones you would get just for being a student enrolled in that outcome area.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Am I hearing all that right? Because this is outcomes are definitely not being a high school person. That's definitely not something that I have a ton of experience or insight into. Does that language make sense?
And also remember, in meeting number 6 is where you really get into definitions. What are clear, consistent definitions for rural, for marginalized, for all those big words that were thrown around? So definition time.
Can we go up to the direct funding and me just ask a quick question about the line, include increased salaries for CTE teachers? Is that needed? Not the increased salary, but since we're already like increasing teachers in another box, increasing salaries overall, they don't, and this is ignorance on my part, do they make more money than I do or any other teacher? Does that make sense? I don't know if that is actually needed, since we've already stated it. I'm just asking about the redundancy more than the.
Well, this came from Aaron's point that a lot of these people could choose to work within their profession, or we're looking to pull people that are experienced within those professions, and that the salaries that are currently offered CTE teachers means that we are not attracting the best candidates for those CTE teaching positions. So that's where that came from, so that we're trying to be competitive with the industry rates. Does that make sense?
But teachers being professionals themselves, I guess I'm asking, do they make more money than the average teacher does teaching CTE?
Can I answer that question for Tammy?
Yes, please.
I think it depends on how the system looks at that, because some systems will match or count their years of experience in the field as teaching experience, whereas other districts who may not have that money may not count those years of experience that those professionals, CT teachers, had out in the field. Again, I've come from 2 different districts. One does, one doesn't. So I think that probably needs to be clarified where that is uniform across the state.
There we go.
Just read over, make sure I captured that.
And I'm just throwing this out there, but maybe even like high need areas. I know like foreign language is a really challenging area to fill positions for, especially in like really specific rural areas. So I don't know if that's something we might want to consider in the future. And then kind of a side to that, I mean, even some like grant opportunities and things like that, I think can be real incentives when we're looking at funding and things like that in those high need areas.
Okay.
Maybe it's just a think on. You don't have to add it in right now.
No, I'm just trying to think where we put that. So the foreign language teachers, I feel like that almost goes with like, fine arts.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of positions that are challenging for they're just those specific positions that sometimes can be difficult to fill.
No, I think,
and not specifically foreign language or, but.
Yeah, no, but that's a great example that we shouldn't just necessarily restrict that to, music and art and gym.
I feel like if we increase the salary of teachers, some of that problem is going to go away. Maybe I'm just being naive. I don't know. But, so I think that that increased salary is going to maybe solve a little bit of that problem too.
Okay. Okay. All right. Any other changes?
Okay, here are the 2 questions I'm submitting. Some of that actually ended up in the chart, the recommendations chart.
Okay.
Yeah. But just some clarification to help spring you into meeting number 5.
Okay. All right. And meeting number 5 is coming up soon. I believe it is the 18th. Yes, the 18th, January 18th.
There you go.
All right. Okay, so we'll review and we'll do our final recommendations. We got a ton done today. Thank you so much for staying focused and so intent and really contributing your thoughts to this conversation and asking such great questions of one another. I just love this group. Seriously, you all are awesome. So I'll see you on the 18th. Email if you have any other questions or thoughts, and we'll be back again in a few weeks.
Yep. Be on the lookout for information regarding the draft formula. So it'll be coming your way during our dead week. And at that point, it'll give you a little bit of prep time to get into that next meeting. So I'll be in touch. Find me in your inbox.
Stay warm. Stay healthy. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.